Let's take it back to the United Kingdom, specifically the year 2014. Longtime viewers might remember this story. It is infamous for the harrowing nature of the offenses and the catastrophic blunders made by the legal authorities. However, this episode peels back more layers than we have previously explored. We need to ask, who was this monster really? And how did his dark history remain buried? It is a narrative that split public sentiment right down the middle. Our protagonist is Sarah Sands, a 32-year-old single mom doing her best to bring up 5 kids on her own. By the middle of 2014, she had relocated her brood to a council property in Silvertown, over in East London. She was looking for a clean slate. While public details about their previous life remain scarce, records indicate they landed in Silvertown just months before their world was turned upside down. Sarah was doing it all without financial help from the children's fathers, leaning instead on government assistance and her own mother for support. Her universe centered entirely on her kids, specifically the 3 youngest boys living with her at the time, Bradley, Alfie, and Ree. She had 2 older children, but they lived elsewhere and were not caught up in the nightmare that struck in 2014. At 12 years old, Bradley was the man of the house. He was social, mature for his age, and always looking for chances to grow. He took his role seriously, acting as a protector for his younger siblings, the twins. The twins, Alfie and Ree, were 11 and practically inseparable. Alfie was the introspective one, quieter than Bradley, but just like his brothers, he lived for soccer and running around outside with his mates. People in the neighborhood remember the trio as full of life, polite, and always ready to lend a hand. They were just normal kids enjoying their youth. Money was tight, but Sarah worked overtime to make sure her boys grew up right. She made sure they were fed, escorted them to the school gates, and tried her hardest to buffer them from the harsher realities of their situation. Locals remember Sarah as a beacon of warmth. She was a social butterfly who made friends easily, always the first to offer aid to anyone struggling. In the Silvertown complex, she made a habit of checking on the older folks. She had a big heart and a trusting nature, but back in 2014, nobody could predict how fast that kindness would be used against her. At first glance, Silvertown seemed like the perfect sanctuary for the Sands clan. The estate was a standard working-class block, complete with apartment rows facing a local elementary school and a play area. The family put down roots quickly, befriending those living nearby. One resident in particular soon became a fixture in their daily routine. Enter Michael Plested, a 77-year-old pensioner living solo in their building. He was a staple of the community, viewed by everyone as a harmless, kindly old gent who picked up shifts at the local convenience store. His sweet, grandfatherly vibe disarmed everyone, Sarah included. She struck up a friendship with him right after unpacking, viewing him as a solitary senior citizen who could use a bit of cheer. Sarah often popped over to his place for tea and a chat. She even cooked him dinner from time to time, later recalling, "I genuinely thought he was just a sweet old man." She appreciated having him around. For a single mother with a hectic schedule, having a senior figure next door who seemed to care about the kids felt like a safety net. He effectively adopted the role of an honorary relative, with the boys even calling him Uncle Mick. Neither Sarah nor the rest of the block sensed the darkness lurking beneath the surface. Shockingly, even the local government was in the dark. Nobody knew he was hiding a rap sheet filled with horrors. As autumn rolled around in 2014, Michael offered the eldest boy, Bradley, a gig sorting papers on weekends. It looked like a great chance for a kid to learn responsibility and earn some cash. Trusting her neighbor implicitly, Sarah gave Bradley the green light. A few times, the twins, Alfie and Ree, tagged along to help their big brother. But then, almost as quickly as it started, Bradley demanded to quit, refusing to go back to Michael's. Simultaneously, he retreated into a shell at home. Sarah was juggling the mayhem of 3 active boys, but she noticed Bradley's sudden mood swings, though she could not get him to articulate what was wrong. The twins also started showing signs of anxiety and went out of their way to steer clear of the neighbor's apartment. Sarah could not connect the dots yet. Her mind simply did not go to that dark place. She had total faith in Michael, never imagining what he was doing behind closed doors. But in late October, the horrific reality came crashing down. While reports vary on the exact moment the dam broke, everyone agrees that the revelation destroyed the family's peace. One night, the twins confessed to their mom that Michael had assaulted them inside his home. Seeing his brother speak up, Bradley, who had been suffering in silence, finally crumbled and admitted he had been abused as well. The trauma was physical. Bradley started rocking back and forth, weeping uncontrollably and tearing at his own hair. Sarah was instantly hit with a wave of heartbreak and crushing self-blame. Looking back on that moment, she stated, "There is no language for how it destroys you. It is a living nightmare. The shame and the guilt are unbearable. I was supposed to be their shield. I should have seen it. It kills me." She had let this predator into her sanctuary, believing he was an ally. Now, the realization that he had exploited her kindness in the vilest way possible was sinking in. Sarah wasted no time and did exactly what she needed to do. She alerted the authorities. Police arrived promptly, arresting Michael at his residence on suspicion of sexual assault. The legal proceedings moved to Snaresbrook Crown Court in East London. He appeared before a judge in mid-November 2014, where the charges were read out and a trial was scheduled for February 2015. Michael entered a plea of not guilty, vehemently rejecting the accusations and indicating he planned to battle the case in court. He refused to take any responsibility. When pressed, he claimed the boys were making it all up and that his hands were clean. But as prosecutors dug into his background, they unearthed some terrifying details. It was discovered that this harmless old man had 24 previous convictions starting way back in 1970. In the 70s, he served nearly 3 years for indecent assault, the exact same type of crime. In the 80s, he was caught doing it again and slapped with another 4-year sentence. Later that same decade, he went away for 6 years for a string of offenses, involving yet more assaults on minors. The most shocking part of this investigation was that his real name was not even Michael. He was born Robin Malt. After a spree of attacks in 1991, he exploited a legal gap that let him change his name. That is when Michael was born. This administrative loophole allowed him to infiltrate new neighborhoods and get jobs without his monstrous history raising red flags. Given his extensive rap sheet and the new allegations, plus the fact that he lived right next to a school and a park, the prosecution argued he needed to stay behind bars until the trial. Keeping him locked up seemed like the only logical move. However, his defense team fought hard against remand. His lawyer played the sympathy card, citing his old age, failing health, and deep roots in the area. They pointed out that he had not been convicted of anything new for nearly 20 years prior to these current accusations. The defense also hammered home the concept of innocent until proven guilty, insisting that the children were lying and the charges were baseless. Unbelievably, these arguments worked. The judge was convinced to release him on bail, accepting the defense's promise that he would follow the rules and show up for court. While the judge did set restrictions specifically banning him from contacting anyone under 18, there was one fatal oversight. The court did not force him to move house. Unbelievably, he was given the green light to return to his apartment in East London, the exact same complex where his victims slept every night. This meant a 77-year-old predator, already with a rap sheet and facing 3 fresh accusations, was free to roam just meters from the children he had allegedly targeted while he waited for his day in court. For Sarah and her sons, the arrest felt like the finish line. They assumed the justice system would step up and permanently scrub this monster from their lives. That sense of security shattered almost immediately. When the pretrial ruling came down, Sarah felt a cold sense of betrayal, and the terror for her boys came rushing back. She didn't stay silent. She demanded answers from law enforcement. Why put a man like that back in a building full of children? She was incensed that the authorities were gambling with the safety of every family in the neighborhood. For young Bradley, the terror was suffocating. He later recalled the sickening proximity. All he had to do was open a window to see straight into the apartment where the abuser lived. Their daily lives spiraled into absolute chaos. Desperate to shield her brood, Sarah went back to the police, begging for a solution. And their advice? It was a slap in the face. Instead of moving the suspect, the authorities told Sarah she should flee for her own safety. Backed into a corner, she had no option but to comply. She scrambled to pack their lives into bags and retreated to her mother's tiny flat miles away. The sudden displacement was a shock to the system. In the blink of an eye, the sanctuary Sarah had fought so hard to build was gone. Life at the grandmother's place was claustrophobic. Bradley remembered the suffocation of losing all privacy, with the whole family squeezed into a single bedroom. The boys camped out in the living room, their sleep broken by terrors. Sarah's mother did her best to play the protector, tucking them in and whispering promises of safety that she hoped were true. But it was a losing battle, and while the boys struggled, Sarah was quietly disintegrating. She was drowning in guilt for missing the signs and burning with rage that Michael was still walking free in her old neighborhood. Why was she the one in exile? Every day that passed felt like a twist of the knife. Sarah later exposed the lack of care, revealing that once the initial police report was filed, the support vanished. The system had chewed them up and spit them out, leaving them completely isolated. Since Michael pleaded not guilty, the boys were slated to testify, a horrific prospect. Yet, even with that looming, victim services offered nothing more than token gestures. Sarah recalls the sheer desperation of those weeks. The thought of her traumatized children having to face their abuser in a courtroom was a weight too heavy to bear. The boys were spiraling, suffering from panic attacks as the trial date crept closer. But Michael would never step inside that courtroom. On November 28, 2014, the breaking point finally arrived. Miles away from the Silvertown estate, Sarah sat alone in her mother's apartment. As the evening set in, she started drinking, trying to drown the noise in her head. She later admitted to downing nearly 2 bottles of wine or brandy, self-medicating against the tidal wave of grief crashing over her. She was in the grip of a total psychological collapse. Pacing the floorboards, she stared at photos of her sons, her agitation mounting with every passing minute. That is when something inside her snapped. She decided she was done waiting for the system. She was going to get a confession out of Michael herself and end the nightmare. Whether she grabbed it for protection or intimidation, she armed herself with a 12-inch kitchen knife. Just after 7 p.m., she stepped out into the East London night. Surveillance cameras tracked a hooded figure cutting across to the neighboring block. She marched right up to Michael's door and knocked, ready to stare down the monster who had shattered her family. Michael opened the door, and she didn't waste time. She demanded the truth. At first, he played the victim, claiming the children were making it all up. But when Sarah stood her ground, the facade crumbled. The mask slipped off. According to Sarah, a smirk spread across his face. He turned arrogant, spitting out that her sons were liars who had ruined his time's life. For Sarah, the world stopped spinning. A toxic cocktail of fear and revulsion surged through her veins. Then, Michael moved, lunging forward to grab her. Instinct took over. With one hand on him and the blade in the other, she met his aggression with lethal force. Fueled by blind panic and fury, she struck. The blade connected 8 times, tearing into his chest and his hands as he tried to block the blows. It was a frenzied blur of violence. Michael managed to drag himself into the hallway before his body gave out. He bled out on the floor. Sarah fled into the night, the weapon still in her grip, as CCTV cameras silently recorded her exit from the estate. She stumbled back to her mother's apartment, trembling and visibly broken. She sat with what she had done for about an hour before making the decision to surrender. She walked into the local precinct, clothes stained with blood, the knife still in her possession. Trembling violently, she looked at the officers and confessed. "I took care of him. I stabbed him." That was her statement. Officers rushed to the scene to find Michael lifeless in a pool of crimson. Confirmation of the death was quickly relayed back to the station. She asked a single question. Was he dead? When the officers nodded, her response was chilling. "He's effing harmless now, ain't he?" The threat to her children was finally extinguished. After her surrender, Sarah Sands was formally arrested and slapped with a murder charge. The case against her was rock solid, backed by a mountain of evidence. They had everything. Her taped confession, the surveillance footage tracking her every step, and the 12-inch blade she had carried into the station. Forensics teams swept the crime scene, matching the carnage in the apartment to the blood soaked into Sarah's clothes. From her cell, she never denied the stabbing, but she maintained she never went there to kill him. The Crown didn't buy it, and the trial kicked off at the infamous Old Bailey in July 2015. The courtroom listened to a minute-by-minute breakdown of the fatal night. Sarah Sands took the stand, opening up about the psychological hell she was living in when she knocked on that door. She testified that her journey to Michael's flat wasn't calculated murder, but an act of pure desperation born from the horror of what he had done to her boys. Her goal, she insisted, was simply to get a confession. She wanted to spare her children the nightmare of taking the stand. But instead of an apology, she got mockery. He denied everything and laughed in her face. That callous lack of remorse, she told the jury, was the trigger that made her snap. The prosecution painted it as a cold-blooded revenge killing. The jury, however, saw it differently. They cleared her of murder, convicting her instead on the lesser charge of manslaughter. They accepted that she had killed him, but concluded it was a result of a loss of control, a violent reaction provoked by his arrogance. Sentencing took place in September 2015. The judge noted that this wasn't a standard case, labeling the circumstances as truly exceptional. While he emphasized that taking a life requires severe punishment and public condemnation, he admitted that the context of this tragedy was unlike anything else on the docket. The court actually acknowledged that this wasn't a calculated, cold-hearted execution, but rather a snap reaction to intense emotional pressure. That said, when handing down the verdict, the judge had to draw a line in the sand, warning that vigilantism isn't acceptable and people can't just act as their own private police force. Luckily for Sarah, there were quite a few points in her favor. For starters, she didn't run. She walked right into the station and turned herself in. She confessed immediately, held nothing back during the investigation, and showed real, gut-wrenching remorse once the adrenaline wore off. Because of those mitigating circumstances, and considering the severe toll the trauma took on her psychological health, the judge went easy on her with a sentence of 3 years and 6 months. To put that in perspective, that is exceptionally light. Usually, fatal stabbings attract sentences of a decade or more behind bars. The judge admitted he initially looked at a 7-year term, but decided to slash it significantly. He also took the opportunity to slam the system's previous failures, questioning how on earth Michael was ever released on bail to begin with. But the saga didn't end there. The Attorney General took one look at the verdict and decided it was way too soft, kicking the case up to the Court of Appeal on the grounds that she got off too lightly. By January of 2016, a panel of top-tier judges reviewed the file and agreed that the punishment needed a serious upgrade. They zeroed in on the uglier details to justify a harsher penalty. The biggest issue was that Sarah grabbed a kitchen knife before she even walked out her door, which screamed premeditation rather than a spur-of-the-moment reaction. The judges also couldn't ignore the fact that she didn't call for help after the attack. She simply walked away and left him there to bleed out. In the eyes of the appeals court, those actions bumped the crime up to a much nastier level of manslaughter. Consequently, they tore up the old sentence and more than doubled it to 7 years and 6 months. Sarah watched the proceedings over a video feed. She didn't fight back or argue, she just took the hit and accepted the longer stretch. Honestly, she probably just felt relieved the nightmare was finally over, figuring 7 years was a fair trade for her children's permanent safety. The public, however, was absolutely livid with the justice system for increasing her time. Fast forward to August of 2018, and Sarah was granted parole after serving roughly 4 years. She split her time between HMP Holloway and HMP Bronzefield. Prison wasn't easy. She battled immense guilt and some really dark thoughts while locked up, but she stayed focused for her boys, calling them every single day. By the time she walked free, her kids were already growing up, hitting their late teens. This wasn't just a local story, it became a massive national controversy. It sparked fierce debates about parental revenge, the flaws in the criminal justice system, and what happens when the state fails to protect its citizens. Opinions were split down the middle. A huge number of people, especially parents, saw Sarah as a hero who did what she had to do to shield her cubs from a monster. On the flip side, you had people arguing that vigilante justice is never the answer, no matter the motive. The whole situation forced everyone to ask uncomfortable questions about morality and the law. Once Sarah was released, her 3 sons decided to break their silence, eventually sitting down for a BBC documentary to share their side of the story. The boys didn't hold back. They talked about the lasting trauma they endured and the chaotic aftermath, but they made one thing crystal clear: they didn't blame their mother for a second. Bradley opened up about the terror of living right across the street from the predator who hurt him. He described the torture of being forced to look at Michael's house every single morning. Alfie pointed out the obvious. If the authorities had kept Michael locked up like they were supposed to, none of this would have happened. He said their mom made them feel safe again, and re-agreed, finding peace in the fact that the man could never hurt anyone else. Of course, it wasn't all positive. He admitted that being separated from their mom while she sat in a prison cell was incredibly painful for them. Yet, despite all the trauma, the brothers were grateful. They thanked their mother for standing between them and danger, convinced she stopped something even worse from happening. In her own interviews later on, Sarah was honest. She wasn't proud of the killing, but the sense of relief was undeniable. She refused to label herself a murderer, and while she knew she broke the law, she couldn't bring herself to regret saving her family. She did her time without complaining because she believed in taking responsibility. But she wasn't done fighting. Sarah started a crusade to change the laws that let dangerous criminals swap their names and vanish. Her case had blown the lid off a scary reality. Michael had legally changed his name to bury a long, nasty history of horrific offenses. Sarah pushed hard for new legislation, arguing it was insane that convicted predators could just erase their identities. She insisted that if you commit crimes like that, you lose the privilege of hiding who you are. She actually got some traction, with several members of parliament backing her up. The Home Office even launched a review into this loophole in 2021, though they kept the full results secret for security reasons. That didn't stop her. Sarah Sands kept pounding the pavement for reform, insisting that predators like Michael are a threat to the nation and the government needs to stop them before they strike again. In the end, the story of Sarah Sands is a heartbreaking case study of what happens when the system completely abandons a family. It started with a single mom just trying to give her kids a fresh start. Instead, she found out her neighbor was a deranged abuser. When no one else would help, she took matters into her own hands and paid a steep price for it. But it leaves us with the ultimate question. If you were in her shoes, what would you have done?